The next series of assemblies we're going to discuss are under the Rainbird name. Rainbird is an irrigation manufacturer that had a private label agreement with Watts, and between 1983 and 1992 sold many assemblies, pressure vacuum breakers, double checks, and RPs that they private labeled with Watts and put the Rainbird tag on it. BAVCO has assembled this little sheet here of crossovers showing you the Rainbird models on the left and the corresponding Watts models on the right. Through that 9-year period, Watts produced many different backflow assemblies, unfortunately, that changed models a few times. They produced the 800 pressure vacuum breakers, the 700 double checks, 709 and 007 double checks, and 709. They produced also the 900, 009, and 909 and 009 series of RPs. So you may have seen any of those Watts models, which we cover when we get to the Watts section, but you might find the corresponding Rainbird version with their model number designation over here. And they did that for a short period of time, again, approximately 83 to 92-ish, and you may find the Rainbird tag on it, but it's the exact same assembly as found in Watts. Next assembly we want to discuss is the Richwell series of backflow assemblies. They made both a double check and an RP. Double check model DC, BF for the model RP, in sizes 3/4 through 2 inch. Units was produced in the mid-70s, about 75 to 78. This is the first version of the model 550 and 575, which we later saw in the Neptune and the Wilkins name. Here's what the model DC double check looked like. Very similar in construction to the model, exactly the same construction as the model 550, which rubber parts are still produced by Wilkins. And the model BF, which is the RP version, again, similar, exactly the same as the model 575. Again, rubber parts are no longer available under the Richwell name, but they are produced today by Wilkins. So for the 550 and 575, you can look to the Wilkins section for repair on this particular model. The next series we want to discuss is Rockwell. Rockwell produced backflow assemblies for a relatively short period from about 1972 to 78. They had model 701, which was a reduced pressure principal assembly in sizes 1.5 through 6. And a double check assembly version, model 711, which was available same size 1.5 through 6. They were a bronze body construction with accesses for the checks from the top. Depending on the size, it was 1 or 2 covers. Relief valve was mounted on the side like this. There are no more rubber repair parts available, I'm afraid. The check mechanism was very similar to what we saw from clay valve with a toggle lever check design, which we'll take apart and show you that in a quick second just to see what it looks like. Relief valve mounted from the side and was very similar to one produced by Wilkins. But anyway, the Rockwell 701 and 711, no more rubber parts are available, but let's take a look at one real quickly just in case you run across one. Here's a cutaway of the 1.5-inch Rockwell RP, inlet side here, outlet over here. You can still see the first check in there, but I've got a cutaway showing what the second check looks like because it was a single bolt held the disc into the disc holder. This was designed to rotate on this pin, and the spring would push pressure down on top and it would pivot up and down like this. Like I say, very similar to what we saw in the clay valve toggle lever design. The check assembly actually sat in a bushing. The stem sat right there, and the seat was held in by some bolts, which you see one there, one at the bottom, held the seat into the body, could be changed. The relief valve, almost identical to what we saw in the larger sizes, meaning 3 through 2.5 through 6 inch on the 575 from Wilkins. The upper diaphragm and the lower rolling diaphragm as a guide, which was right down through here. So this is the Rockwell 701 and 711 double check and RP. No more rubber parts available, but wanted to let you see what one looked like inside in case you ever run across it. Next manufacturer we're going to discuss are the SMR series. SMR stood for Surgical Mechanical Research Company. SMR is one of the oldest companies making backflow assemblies from the early 50s. Discontinued around 77. They sold their models off to different companies. Neptune and Wilkins ended up with some of them. The 701 and 701S, S standing for spring load, because the original 701s did not have a spring-loaded air inlet. It was strictly atmospheric loaded back in the 50s and 60s before the codes were around. And they were made in such a way that the 701 could be converted, field modified to a 701S. We know that's a big bozo no-no today, but back then that was allowed. Anyway, the 701 pressure vacuum breaker size is 1/2 through 1 inch. Rubber parts are no longer available for the air inlet or the check spring, but the check assembly is the same check assembly as used in the model 720 as produced by Wilkins today. So technically there's no more rubber repair parts, but if all you need is a check assembly disc, you can rebuild the 701 realistically. Anyway, let's take a look and see what one looks like, just so you know what it looks like. The 701 pressure vacuum breaker and 701S looks like this. No, the ball valves aren't on here, but you get an idea. Canopy on the top, 3-prong bonnet on the top, unscrewed from the air inlet bonnet. Underneath it would be our air inlet seat, air inlet spring, air inlet float, like that. This was the part that was converted back in the early 70s. There was no air inlet spring when this was first made from 1955 till about the end of the 60s. And it actually had a very small air inlet loading. You can see it better on the 2-inch when I get to that, where this stainless steel plate on top actually bent slightly, which gave it a small, less than a pound loading. But to give it a positive loading, this spring was added, and it was a field modification that was utilized back then. Check assembly, like we've seen several today, the check assembly is the same as the 720, as I mentioned. To remove the spring, like some of the other ones like this. Check spring, disc hold. I'm going to say it looks like the 720, that's because it is. It sits in the body just like this. To put it back in, reverse. Assembly, the disc, the spring has that cone-shaped disc where one coil is smaller than the other, so it just makes it so that you can walk those spring coils all the way around. You have to sit under that lip, just like that, so that the coils sit all the way underneath. That'll make sure that the spring tension is pushing flat on the disc holder. This was also the first time we saw the introduction of these needle valve test cocks. They were made under the SMR name, also under the Neptune, and also under Wilkins. Wilkins, when they went to the newer versions of all of these, got rid of the needle valve design because it didn't get full flow through them, and went to a standard test cock in around 2000. But anyway, this is what the needle valve test cocks looked like. There was an O-ring on the end, and a small little orifice which sat right there. You can see the hole, which came out through the center of that test cock. So in order to operate the test cock, you had to put your fittings on there, and then had to turn this whole thing, which got kind of cumbersome, especially if you had a needle valve compensator on there. You'd have to turn the whole thing trying to get water to activate through the test cock. But these were the older versions. They did use a standard test cock for a while, which looked like these, petcock type thing. But they went to this, and then eventually went back to the current style ball valve test cock. Anyway, model 701. The only parts that are available are the check discs, and that's a pressure vacuum breaker in sizes 1/2 through 1 inch. The next pressure vacuum breaker we're going to discuss in the SMR is the 711 and 711S designation pressure vacuum breaker, again made from early 50s up till late 70s. Again, the original S711 did not have an air inlet loading above 1 pound. A spring was added and a bonnet was changed in the early 70s to make sure that, mid-70s, to make sure that it did have a positive 1 pound air inlet loading. 711 was replaced by the model 720 under SMR's name, which is currently in production from Wilkins. But the S711 repair parts are no longer available except for the check assembly, which is the same one as used in the model 720. Let's take a quick look at the 711 series in case you run across one. The original 711 series had a bolted-on cover like you see here. When these were made to be field replaced with an air inlet loading, they were discontinued because there was no way to adapt this in the field to a 1 pound air inlet loading. It could not be modified in the field. So if you ever see the bolted-on cover on the 711, they will have to be replaced. But the 711s, and there were a bunch made around like that. Here's the one with those needle valve test cocks as we've seen. Canopy comes off from the top. Underneath the bonnet is unscrewed. It seals by a gasket, so it has to be relatively tight. Underneath that is our air inlet seat and our float assembly like this. There is an air inlet spring that sits in the retainer right here inside that bonnet, so that's where that spring sits. And when the bonnet poppet sits on top of it like that, that gives it its air inlet loading. Now, as I said, this had an air inlet loading, but it wasn't a full 1 pound. If you'll notice, there were 3 little stainless steel washers on the top of this rubber disc. And what happened when it closed, these actually deflected slightly, which gave it less than the 1 pound loading. But to make sure it was consistently above 1 pound, this bonnet was changed that had that little knob there that holds that spring that gives it its air inlet loading. So the only ones that were approved was the 711S, which has the spring for the air inlet. Check assemblies, gasket on the top, removing the check spring, grab one side, pull it out of the body like this. Check assembly is still produced in the model 720. You see it looks just like the 720 check. That's because it's the exact same check module that used in the 720. Check spring is different. Reassembly, if you can rebuild it, you can use the 720 check disc, but that's the only part that is available any longer. Just like the other cone-shaped springs, push each of the coils down underneath the lip until it gets to the last coil and make sure it's square underneath. Gasket seal on the top, air inlet with the bonnet with the float on it, makes it the 711S, which gives it the 1 pound air inlet loading. Anyway, if you see any of the model 711 or 711S, that's what they look like. The only rubber parts that are still available are the check assemblies. If you see the oldest version, which had the bolted on cover, those were not field modified and were not repairable at that time, so most of those were discontinued. That's the model 711. The next SMR assembly we're going to discuss is the model 714, which is kind of an interesting footnote valve. This is an air inlet head. It was only used as to take a double check and convert it to a 2-check pressure vacuum breaker. Several manufacturers made standard double checks in the larger sizes 2.5 through 10, and they wanted to have the ability to make a pressure vacuum breaker in those sizes. Standard pressure vacuum breakers are 1/2 through 2 in an angle format. So they wanted to find a way to convert a double check into a PVB in the larger sizes, and what they found is they would mount this air inlet head on the down side of the second check. They analyzed it and found out that it actually did not have enough air vacuum brake to relieve a vacuum on the larger sizes, especially the 6, 8, and 10. So they were discontinued. Mostly the 714s appeared in the BAVCO series with their model VC. But anyway, the model 714 air inlet head is kind of a little footnote valve that converted a double check into a 2-check PVB. So the 714 air inlet head, as I said, was mounted through a piping arrangement on the downside of the number 2 check. Here's the model 711 pressure vacuum breaker, which had a check and an air inlet. Here's the model 714, and you notice I'll spin it. There is no access for a discharge like we see here, only inlet side on the bottom. So it was an air inlet head, screwed on by elbows and nipples on the bottom, back side, downside of the number 2 check to make a double check into a 2-check pressure vacuum breaker. Same thing with the bonnet that had the spring knob so that it can be converted to a positive load, which happened in the early 70s, but that's the model 714 air inlet head. The next assembly we're going to discuss in the SMR series is the model DHC, which is a double check assembly that was produced in sizes 3/4 through 2 inch. Rubber parts are no longer available. Production was from late 50s, early 60s through about 76. It's a bronze body construction with a modularized inline check design. In other words, the checks were modularized, first and second check. Checks could be rebuilt outside of the check body. Let's take a look and see what one looks like in case you ever run across one. Here's the 2-inch with the cover off the top so you can see access to the check assembly here. What you're looking at is this. That's what the check assembly looks like threaded into the body. There are holes on the top to get a rod so that you could unscrew the check assembly, which came out in one piece like this. 3 screws held the check assembly together so you could change the check disc like this. They used a vulcanized clapper plate. You see that a lot of models today. This was the original design that first had that design where the disc was vulcanized to a rubber plate. Very similar to a BAVCO model that we saw produced for a short period. Double check version like this. This is the SMR model DHC. Rubber parts no longer available. Next assemblies we're going to look at is the Toro series of backflow assemblies. This is their RP version model 800059 and 9-2770. They had a different model number for each size. The 8059 was 3/4, the 1-inch was the 9-2770. It was a reduced pressure principal assembly. Rubber parts are no longer available. It was a brass bodied unit, had the ball valve shutoffs on the bottom like we saw in the Orion design. This was the original version that was later changed to the model BRP. But this was the first version that they produced, from mid-60s till the late 70s. Anyway, modularized checks that threaded into the check base here, relief valve mounted in the center underneath the cover. Let me show you what it looks like just in case you ever run across one. Here's what the valve looks like. Here's a cutaway version to give you an idea what it looks like inside the cover. To disassemble it, there were 4 bolts that came off. The top came off, exposed the 2 check assemblies that threaded into the body. The relief valve was attached to the top with a diaphragm on the top. So that's the RP version, the 80-0059 and the 9-2770 RP versions from Toro. Later produced under the Orion name, but most of them are made under the Toro name. But you'll see, if you ever see any of them, they will have to replace because rubber parts are no longer available. Toro also produced a double check version, 3/4 inch model 80-0060, 1 inch model 9-2780. Same basic construction as we saw in the RP version with the 4 bolts on the top, cover comes off, and the 2 check valves. Obviously no relief valve in the middle because this is a double check only. Let me show you what it looks like real quick in case you ever run across one, because rubber parts are no longer available. Here's what the 1 inch looked like. Very similar to the 2 inch that we saw in Orion. It has those shutoffs that have that union end ground joint on the end of the shutoff valve that's held in by a bolt in the very center. So a lot of times if you saw these in there, those shutoffs would be replaced because back in the old days these were just straight old gate valve shutoffs. They didn't have the resiliency requirement. But here's a cutaway showing what it looks like inside. There's the 2 check assemblies, the second check and the first check over here. The check assembly is just unscrewed out and replaced. Rubber parts are no longer available, so if you see any of the double check versions from Toro, they will have to be replaced because rubber parts are no longer available. But that's what it would look like if you saw them. As I mentioned back in the Orion series, that Toro was the original manufacturer and they sold the designs to Orion. They bought them from Toro. Toro was the original manufacturer and again sold to Orion in the early 80s. Anyway, the Toro BDC and BRP is what we saw in the Orion series, double check BDC and RP version metal BRP. Toro produced them originally in the 3/4 and 1 inch sizes only. When Orion took over, they expanded it all the way up to 6 inch. But anyway, this is what the Toro BDC and BRP, the original versions that we saw in the Orion series under the Toro name. The next assembly we're going to discuss from Toro is their pressure vacuum breaker. It was listed under different models, the model PVB Toro, PVB, and the model 80-0550 for the 3/4 and the 80-0560 for the 1 inch. Rubber parts are still available for this unit, and Toro still does produce this unit as of today. It was the one model that they did keep. In other words, Toro produced double checks and RPs that they sold off to the Orion company in the early 70s. And this is the one model that they did keep, a pressure vacuum breaker. Toro, being an irrigation-oriented company, felt this was a product that they could continue to sell, and they still make it as of today. Like many of the Toro/Orion designs, they used an integral ball valve where the ball valve was built into the side of the backflow body. Unions were provided on the inlet and the outlet of the assembly also. The check assembly, check spring, air inlet spring, and bonnet. Those are the parts of the PVB. Let's go ahead and take it apart and see what one looks like. Toro pressure vacuum breaker. Integral ball valve shutoff, so the shutoffs are built right into the backflow body itself, as you can see here. Disassembly, all the test cocks on the back side here. Disassembly, bonnet assembly will unscrew from the top. Yes, the canopy does not have to be unscrewed to replace the bonnet because it comes off in one piece. This is my check spring. This is my air inlet assembly, and there's my check assembly. So the way it sits inside the body is that this check spring sits over that, and the air inlet actually sits here, the spring going over it. So that's kind of what it would look like inside the body itself. Air inlet floating up and down through the center. Air inlet is provided by a spring, and as you can see right there, there's the air inlet spring. It sits inside that float assembly. So reassembly, replace the air inlet disc, replace the air inlet check assembly. You can buy the whole check assembly itself and the whole air inlet with the air inlet spring like that. Spring on top, bonnet. Bonnet is sealed by an O-ring. And that's the Toro pressure vacuum breaker. Next assembly we're going to discuss is the Viking Model A1, produced in sizes 4 through 10 inch. This is a double check assembly, inlet gate valve outlet, first check, second check assembly, single access cover for each check on the top, meaning that there's 2 access, one for the first check, one for the second check. It is a swing hinge check assembly, so there's a plug on the outside to drive the pin out that takes the whole check assembly out from the top. It's a weight-loaded check. It was a lead-weighted, but the weight was encapsulated in a bronze body holder, and a single bolt held the disc into the disc holder. Production was from mid-70s to about 1889 is when it was discontinued. It was a galvanized body. Rubber parts are still available from Viking. Viking is a manufacturer of fire sprinkler equipment and sold single checks, and they bolted two of these together and submitted to the approval agencies as a double check assembly. But it's no longer in production today, but rubber parts are still available. Let's take a look at the Model A1. Here's the check assembly out of an 8-inch. Again, here's where the single pin sits. They drive out through the body and the whole check assembly underneath it. One bolt holds the disc into the disc holder. The linkage mechanism back here, but here's the problem with the weight. It's a bronze holder, but unfortunately what they did is they filled it with lead. So there is exposed lead in the water passageway, as you can see here, and this whole area, which is brass, contains it like a bucket. And that's where the loading of the check comes from, a weight loading. But because it has exposed lead, you might want to be careful with your water disc if that's allowed or not. Otherwise, one bolt changes the rubber disc for the average repair. Anyway, that's the check mechanism of the Viking Model A1.